Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Tayo, and I'm a first-year PhD student from the UCI Statistics Department. And today I will be discussing a methodological approach my professor and I have been recently working on. Specifically, we will be discussing a latent class model for planned missingness designs with the International Affective Picture System. To give an overview of my presentation, I'll first begin by discussing the project and how it came about from a problem that we encountered with a collaborator. I will then describe how we decided to address the problem in our methods and handling section, and then I'll briefly touch on some of the results of our analysis, as well as some of the final thoughts and future goals for this project. So let's begin with the project overview. So my advisor and I were lucky enough to work with Dr. Elizabeth Martin and Jen Blank, both from the UCI Department of Psychology. Their team recently has been working on updating the normative ratings for the International Affective Picture System, the IAPS, and part of their goals were aimed to explore how demographic variables such as gender and ethnicity might influence responses to images from the International Affective Picture System, which we're referring to as IAPS. They have surveyed a sample of 1,008 individuals to gather data on mean ratings and positive emotion, negative, and emotional arousal, that is, elicited by the images, as well as to categorize images into positive, emotional, and negative neutral categories. And they reached out to my advisor as they had a substantial amount of missingness in their data, approximately 90%. So this was due to their study design where each individual participant only received a subset of the IAPS, only two sets of images, each was 60, so 120 in total out of the 1,182 slides. To get an idea of what each participant recorded, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see 6 images from the IAPS image collection. This is just some random subset. And they vary wildly in content and composition, as you can see here, and they have been selected to elicit a wide range of emotional response in participants, the entire subset. So if you were an individual in the study, you would, for instance, be shown one image at a time, and then be asked to give 3 measurements, all on a Likert scale, where the Likert is an agreement scale, where 1 is strongly agree, and up to 9 would be strongly agree. 1 would be strongly disagree, 9 strongly agree, where 5 is a neutral or indifferent score. And you would put down a response for how positive, negative, and emotionally arousing you found the image. Okay. So due to the large portion of missingness, 90% was missing, each individual, again, was only received 10% of the collection. It would be really difficult to conduct group differences for each individual slide, as each slide had about 50 individuals only, and there was then really low power and made it difficult for our collaborators to detect true effects or differences between groups. So our goal was to try and find a way to leverage the individual recorded data in order to retrieve or make inference on the unobserved data. And so we decided that we needed to collapse the data and perform dimension reduction by clustering the slides together. So this leads us to part 2 method, specifically dimension reduction. We break this portion into 2 main sections. First, we are going to cluster the IAPS slides by their average measures for the data, positive, negative, and arousal. And this makes sense intuitively, as the IAPS slides are included in their sets historically in order to elicit some kind of emotional response. And it makes sense to think that some of these slides are going to give off similar responses to others. A dog and baby might make you happy, for example. However, we need to decide upon the number of clusters to capture the underlying structure of the data, while also providing enough statistical power to draw meaningful conclusions. So then after that, we want to calculate an average cluster measure for the data for each individual score, positive, negative, and arousal. This will ultimately reduce and hopefully remove their missingness from the data set. However, we also need to decide if, when averaging this individual data to get an individual cluster score, if we want to use all the slides in each cluster or some kind of subset. And we're going to be treating this as a tuning parameter. So in order to cluster the slides, we decided upon using k-means clustering, which we clustered on the summary statistics for each slide, which included the average positive, negative, and arousal score for each slide or image. To determine the optimal number of clusters, we minimized the within sum of squares and ultimately settled on k equals 5 as it minimized the within sum of squares based on an elbow plot, which our choice was also supported in previous research. So if you look on the left side, you can see the final 5 clusters. Here, each dot is one of the 1,182 images or slides, plotted with the average positive and negative on the x and y axis, respectively, as this gave the most clear separation. If you glance at the right-hand side, you can also see next to each cluster, the cluster number. We also have a name or description for each cluster, which are not arbitrary, but based off the cluster scores for each of the 3 measurements. For example, cluster 1 was called negative, the pink one. It was called negative as it had the highest average negative measure across all clusters. This is also reflected in the plot on the left here. As you can see, it's in the most negative, the highest part on the y-axis. Further, cluster 4, the blue one, is called neutral as it has a relatively even score in both like the positive, negative, and arousal category. And they're all close to around 2 for all 3 measures. And it's located on the dot plot in the very center between the 2 axes in blue. All the clusters had around 200 slides. The smallest was 195 and the largest was 310. And this table gives an idea of how the names were decided for each cluster. It's worth noting that the slides do have names and descriptions, the individual slides that is, some being similar to others, and we were able to list the most common or top description in the far right column, which did seem to correlate to the final cluster name and the average measure makeup. Okay. So now moving on to the second portion, having clustered the slides, we're now able to make a cluster measure score for each individual, which will be an average positive, negative, and arousal score for each cluster using the data that the individual has. So although the individual doesn't have all the slides, it's more likely that they'll have some portion of the slides in each of the clusters, allowing us to make a latent cluster measure score for each of the 5 clusters. However, we need to decide if the individual cluster scores should use all the slides in each cluster. We expect that the total proportion of missingness to decrease as we use more data. However, this would also make the clusters harder to distinguish, as there isn't great separation between the clusters, which we saw before, and when we were looking at all 182 slides. But to maximize separation between clusters, we instead decided to use the most representative slides, that being the ones closest to the center or centroid of the cluster. And I hope to make this more clear in the following slides. So if you look on the left again, we see that all the slides used in the clusters are displayed, and that there isn't great separation between them, and that there's actually fair bits of overlap. So in order to get the most separation, we can actually select the most representative slides closest to the centroid of each cluster, where here on the right we have the top 10, which we can see here has very clear separation between the 5 clusters. You can see very distinct groups. However, with only 10 slides per image, individuals still may not have data on those 10 slides, and thus there may be missingness, which is what we were trying to diminish in the first place. So if we change and treat the number of slides used as a tuning parameter, we can see how the proportion of missingness changes over time. So we can see how, as you increase it here, this is for top 20 and top 50, they all have a good separation. And next, if we look at the overall final proportion of missingness in the final data set for the original versus top 10, 20, and 50, and all the slides per cluster, we can see how substantially the drop is from just using the top 10, but we only really get a reduction to 0 achieved when we use the top 50. We can also get that with using all the clusters, but again, this one also allows for a clear separation between them, which we ended up using only the top 50 for our final analysis. So for the final section, we can discuss some of the analysis done using the latent cluster data. Specifically, our collaborator was interested in comparing differences in race and sex. Our data was limited to the races which only had large enough sample sizes to make inference on, that being white, Hispanic, East Asian, and Southeast Asian. As seen here, some summary statistics as well. So we adjusted for multiple comparison using a false discovery rate of around 10%. The following showed some significant differences between the race categories at the 5% level. For the most left column, this refers to the cluster number and the cluster measure. So 1-arousal refers to cluster 1, which was the negative cluster, implying that Hispanic versus East Asian had differences in their average negative cluster arousal scores. Okay, and we can further see that these visualize in box plots, where they are showing the different measures and for what cluster there was a difference between race groups. So again, the first one circled in yellow here outlines that the 1-arousal or cluster 1 average arousal score difference was significant, implying that Hispanic versus East Asian had differences in their average negative cluster arousal scores. So this was for the first 2 measures, and then we can also see the third measure here, negative, also had some differences. We also did this for sex differences between males and females for the different clusters. Here we also adjusted for multiple comparison using an FDR of 10%, and these were all also significant at the 5% level, which one can interpret similarly for the races. For example, again, we can see that the 1-arousal refers to cluster 1, which is the negative cluster arousal measure, implying that males versus females had differences in their average negative cluster arousal scores. Here, the comparison is men minus women, so we can actually see that the men had a lower arousal score for the negative cluster. Okay. And again, we can display the plots across the measures within the clusters here in the box plots. None of the neutral categorical cluster groups actually had any significant differences, which was somewhat interesting to our collaborator here. And again, you can see positives. So next we can move on to our conclusion. So to summarize, in this study, we employed dimension reduction techniques by clustering slides together using within sum of squares. We captured IAPS images based off effective attributes, identifying distinct clusters, and maximize cluster separation using centroid distance, and used a tuning parameter using the top 10 to 50 slides, optimizing our analysis, and utilize the top 50 to get our individual cluster measure scores, and effectively overcoming the missingness in our data set. So overall, this approach, we were able to demonstrate here how the feasibility and effectiveness of conducting analysis in the present of planned missingness data. So in our future endeavors, we want to focus on refining our model for understanding and incorporating advanced methodological approach. We want to integrate machine learning as well as conduct validation studies to assess the robustness and generability of our clustering results across other populations and ensuring the reliability of our findings. Lastly, I would like to thank my advisor and as well as our collaborators from the Department of Psychology and all of you here today, as well as the NISS for this opportunity. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you again.